The next feature that I'd like to start working towards is making it possible for a promoter to go ahead and create a concert without actually automatically publishing that concert, and giving them some way to go in after the fact and go ahead and publish this concert when they're ready. Now this implies a few different features. One is some sort of publish button somewhere where the promoter can click that and now go ahead and make the concert published, but that also implies this feature of somehow being able to view a concert in the back end where this publish button can live, so they can go ahead and publish the concert from there. I think the natural way to do that is maybe some sort of edit screen for the concert, so the promoter can go ahead and update any details while they're kind of fine-tuning the information for the concert, save those changes, and then publish the concert when they're ready to make it public. But that implies yet another feature. How does someone get to this edit page to go ahead and make these changes and then publish the concert? I think the natural solution to that is something like a concert index view, just a listing view where the promoter can go into the backstage area, see all the concerts that they've created, and click through to each one to get to that edit screen and eventually publish the concert. So I think the right place to start is by trying to drive out this concerts index view. So let's start by adding a new test to our feature backstage area, and we'll call it view concert list test. So a test that tests that someone can view a list of all the concerts that they've created. So I'll go ahead and scaffold out a test case here, and we'll specify the namespace as tests feature backstage. And then let's think about the very first test that we want to write here. So I think the first test that I'd like to write is something like making sure that someone who's not a promoter can't get back here and see any promoter's concert list. So maybe we'll call this test something like guests cannot view a promoter's concert list. So how's this going to work? I think the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and visit some endpoint where we want this to exist, right? So maybe we do something like response equals this get, and then make a request to something like backstage concerts, which could be our index view. And we don't need to create a user or log in as anyone or anything because we're just trying to do this as a guest. So now let's make sure that when someone tries to do this, they don't actually get through and that they're redirected to the login screen. So maybe something like response, assert status 302 to make sure that's a redirect, and then assert that they're redirected to the login area. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So we get an error that we expected a 302 but received a 405. Now 405 is a method not allowed response. And this is because if we go ahead and look at our routes file, you can see that we do have a backstage concerts endpoint, but it's a post endpoint. So right now you can only make post requests to this endpoint, not get requests. So that's why we're getting that 405 back. So let's go ahead and add another route, but a get version of this route that goes ahead and returns the concert index. So I'm going to add a new get route to the top of this route group here. We'll call it route get concerts, and we'll point that at the concerts controller index method. Let's go ahead and run the test again and see what we get this time. Okay, awesome, and we get a passing test. So even though we don't actually have this index method driven out or anything like that yet, it doesn't matter because this auth check is happening before the user is actually taken to this route. So let's work on our next test, which will hopefully help us drive out the actual implementation of the index method on the concerts controller. So if we go back to a view concert list test, I think the next test that we want to write is something like making sure that a promoter can see a list of their concerts, right? So let's add another test, and we'll say promoters can view a list of their concerts. So we're going to want to go ahead and create a user, right? A promoter in this case. Let's say user equals factory user class create. And it doesn't really matter what any of the details are there because we're not going to be making any assertions about them. And then we could go ahead and create some concerts for this user by saying concerts equals factory concert class, and then provide a quantity that we want to create, like maybe 3. And then make sure that we go ahead and create this and specify the ID of the user that we want the concerts to belong to. So in that case, it's the user that we created with our factory. And if we go ahead and make sure to pull in our database migrations trait here, so that our database is all set up for us, then if we dump our concerts, with any luck, we'll be able to see that we did in fact create 3 concerts for this user. So you can see here that it does look like we have 3 concerts. Here's concert 2, and it belongs to the correct user, and same with concert 1 and concert 0 up here. Now you might be asking yourself, okay, what's the best way for us to continue forward here? What sort of assertions do we want to make? And is that going to impact the sort of data that we want to set up with our concerts? If we wanted to go ahead and make some assertions in the actual template and make sure that we see certain strings related to the concert, then we would definitely want to actually specify those when we create each concert. But I want to show you a different way of making assertions about data that's in the view that doesn't rely so much on those sort of what I think are fragile assertions. So first, let's just go ahead and make a request to the Backstage Concerts endpoint. So let's say response equals this, acting as user, get Backstage Concerts. And now let's go ahead and assert that we got a 200 status back to make sure that the user actually does get back to this area. And then let's think about how to make some of these assertions about making sure that these concerts are visible to this user. So here's a trick that I like to use a lot of the time that doesn't involve making assertions against the template. If you look at Laravel's response class, so if we go illuminate HTTP response, you can see that the response has this response trait that it pulls in. So let's dive down the rabbit hole a little bit further. Response trait. And if you look at this response trait, it contains this property called original, which is the original content of the response. Now, if you don't know what this means, it doesn't sound that interesting, but I'll show you what is interesting about it. Let's head back to our test and do something interesting here. So if we do dd response original and run this test, let's just see what happens. Okay, so we're getting a 500. So let's go ahead and disable exception handling so we can kind of figure out what the root cause of this error is. And if we scroll up here, it looks like the index method does not exist on the controller. Cool. So let's head over to our concerts controller and take this a few steps further until I can show you this neat trick with the response. So I'm going to add a method here called index. And for now, we'll just leave it empty and go run this test again. Okay, so you can see that what we're getting back as response original is null, right? And that doesn't sound that interesting until you realize that what that actually represents is whatever was returned from index. Check this out. If I return a random string like hello world and go run this test again, you'll see response original is now hello world. Now, the reason that this is interesting is because if we return a view from our controller, we actually get an instance of that view object here. And we can make some interesting assertions about the view object itself rather than about the template. Let's go ahead and look at Laravel's view class for a second. If we go into illuminate view here and look at the list of methods, you can see there's a method here called getData, and it's a public method. And what this does is it gives you back all of the data that was bound to that view. So using this function, we can make assertions about the data that was attached to the view when the controller returned it. I'll show you what I mean. For example, say we wanted to make an assertion that the view contained a concerts variable, and that concerts variable contained all of the concerts that we created here. We could do that using something like this. We could say response original, which is going to return a view instance. Then we could say get data, which is going to return an array of all the data bound to the view. And then we could try and access the concerts key. And then inside of that list of concerts, we could verify that this contains the concerts that we have up here by doing something like contains, since this is going to be, say, an eloquent collection, for example. Then we could say concerts 0. So make sure that this does in fact contain the first concert from this list. And if we went ahead and bundled that inside of an assertion that looked something like this, assert true, then we could go ahead and run our tests and hopefully get some sort of useful error here. Okay, so we're getting an error called to get data on string because we're still returning a string from the controller and not any sort of view. So let's return a view, and we'll say that it is the Backstage Concerts index view, which doesn't exist yet, and we won't pass any data to it. Instead, we'll just see what the test tells us. Okay, so scrolling up here, we get an error that there is no concert index view. So inside of our resources, views, Backstage Concerts area, let's create an index.blade.php file, but we'll just leave it empty for now and go ahead and run the test again. So now we get an error undefined index concerts. I just want to show you one thing quickly here. Now that we're actually returning a view, let's go ahead and dump this response original again. So now you can see that we do get this giant view instance object. I'll scroll all the way up to the top so you can see. So we have illuminate, view, view, and this is the object that we were looking at. If we go ahead and dump get data on that and run it again, you see we get an empty array back. If we head over to the controller and we do something like foo bar and run the test again, you'll see now we get the data that was passed to the view, which is really cool. So since we want to assert that it has a concerts index and that it contains this concert, let's go ahead and figure out how to make that work. So the easiest way I can think to get that working is to make sure that we pass through some sort of concerts key here. And I think we can get this passing by just doing concert all. Now, something that I think is important to think about and pay attention to is that a lot of the time you might be tempted to do something like auth user concerts right here instead, which will give us all the concerts for that user. Now that is something that we do want to get to eventually, but we actually don't have any tests that forced us to write this implementation. So if I notice that, hey, I could get this passing in a way that's sort of cheating, that proves to me that I'm missing a test of some kind, I prefer to write it in the way that's sort of cheating so I don't forget to add test coverage for the other behavior that I'm interested in. So in this case, we'll just make sure that we have concert imported, and we'll return all the concerts in the system and pass them to the view. So let's go ahead and run this test again, but this time I actually want to dump the response original get data so we can see those concerts coming through. And you can see if we scroll all the way up here, we do have an array that contains a concerts eloquent collection that has 3 items in it, which I'm assuming are going to be our 3 concerts. So let's get rid of this DD here and go ahead and run this test again. Awesome, so now this test is passing. So we can go ahead and add 2 more assertions here to verify that it contains concerts 1 and concerts 2. And if we go ahead and run this test, now it's passing and all 4 assertions are passing. So in the next lesson, I want to add that additional test to make sure that a promoter can't see any other promoters' concerts.